So like I mentioned, and we'll cover some skills in de-escalating situations with instructors and peers, kind of the best habits there are for when you can be upset by text communication, where you believe text communication can come off as threatening or insulting or disrespectful, and how to move on from that. So really, the first part is how in-person versus online communication really differs. The fact that when you're working in a distance, when you're going to school, and you only know your peers and your instructors through email, through what's posted in the course, you're missing out on a lot of things that is natural to human communication to interpret the meaning behind what someone is saying. Body language, tone of voice, eye contact are all important parts of in-person communication that allows you to really convey a message across to someone. You miss that on text. The fact that there's a delay in response can sometimes add tension to a situation where if you're getting responses, what it seems to be like pretty quickly in a couple hours to a few hours, and now you go days without hearing a response, that can also add tension where you think that you're being ignored, or you feel that someone's not paying you the attention that you need or is necessary, which is different than when you're having a conversation. Have that conversation with someone immediately. You don't have to wait days for an answer. Reactionary communication is something too where with a text only, you can take a couple hours to script communication. So a lot of people think it's even more so pointed, that it's more finalized. Where in an in-person conversation, a lot of it can be off the cuff. It could be you can have small talk, and really that's lost in in-text communication. So there's no breaking of the ice. You don't feel a connection through in-text communication. There's no emotion. It's really hard to convey. It's also hard to read emotion through text communication. It can be very easily misconstrued through an email communication or a post in a classroom from your instructor, or feedback. Sometimes can come off harsher than you may think because of the ability to not really have a in-person conversation with your instructor. Or with a peer, when you're having a discussion board conversation with peers and you don't necessarily know how, it could seem that the communication is really harsh because it's in text, and there is no really sense of this is a conversation that you both are sharing versus someone having finalized communication on the right or wrong side of how that argument or that discussion is going in the discussion boards. The importance of tone and meaning. Tone is so difficult to convey and interpret over text. A lot of the issues I've seen, a lot of the situations I've been looped in on is because of a misinterpretation of tone from being a student who believes the feedback they're receiving from their instructor is targeted, because they're interpreting the tone as the instructor's out to get them, and it's not just critical feedback. So it's important to not necessarily assume the worst. You kind of have to assume the best in communication that you get from your instructor or from a peer, because they may not know how that text communication is coming off. All caps isn't always bad. That's something that I think is a common misconception, where people believe that all caps is yelling all the time, where really it's a stylistic choice that some instructors may use as emphasis. So it's not necessarily the fact that they're yelling or they're angry about a certain point that they put in all caps, but they may just be using it to draw your attention in a message. Punctuation is very important, even in email communication. Punctuation allows you to kind of break up how you would say something. It allows the reader to kind of convey a message in which they just can't get from a stream of consciousness and run-on sentence. And so punctuation actually helps you convey tone through text conversation. So even if you're writing an email conversation to your instructor, it's really important to pay attention to your punctuation because the instructors may misinterpret your tone or your meaning as well based on your use of punctuation. It's important to, proofread, make sure that you are including specific punctuation to convey the correct message. And there have been many times where I've seen where it's just been miscommunication because through email communication, there's two different styles where instructors may treat email communication more formally while students may treat it more informally, almost as like a text conversation where punctuation necessarily is the most important thing. But you really need to understand, one, maybe the expectations of communication from your instructor and what that looks like and what they're expecting when you communicate through an email. And two, that you are intently responding with correct punctuation to ensure that you're conveying the best, the most truest message that you want to get across. And if something does upset you, if something seems to be too pointed, something seems to be like, that's kind of mean, or did they really mean to say it like that? Ask clarifying questions. Because we don't have tone or meaning, because it's so hard to get across in text communication, especially if it's very quick in feedback, if it's quick in the Ask Your Instructor form, in the discussion board form. It never hurts to ask your peer or your instructor and send them an email and let them know, like, I was confused over this point, or this point seemed to lead me to believe that you were upset with me, or that you were picking on me, or did you really mean to say this, or did you mean to say it this way? Be sure to ask clarifying questions, because sometimes people, instructors, can be guilty of writing something without proofreading and sending it and not really meaning to say what they said. And things can come off very differently in text versus when you say it aloud, because you don't have that inflection. You don't have that, again, body language or that tone. So how to navigate? I always tell people the first thing is, if you get a message or you get some feedback from your instructor that upsets you, is take a step back. Read the message, and if it upsets you, get up, go for a little walk, take a breath, grab a drink of water, and then come back and sit down and reread it. Because the first time you read it, it may sound worse than it is. You may notice something you didn't notice the first time you read it. And I always encourage students to assume the best intention, that the instructor is really, for the most part, they're on your side. They want you to succeed in the course together. It's their job to help you succeed. And if you receive feedback or communication that seems very pointed, that can be discouraging, that the first thing I say is assume the best intention, but then don't feel afraid to ask those clarifying questions. To really ask, hey, this is what you left in my feedback. Is this what you really meant to say? Because it seems that you're saying this. Read it aloud multiple times. I always say this for feedback or communication, especially if you're reading it from your instructor or your peer or friend. Read it aloud. Anything that comes through text and you're kind of questionable on the meaning or what the person's really trying to say, is read it a couple times. Read it a couple times in a different style of voice, so you can really understand what that person was trying to get across. It may help you come across different meanings in the text. It may help you feel better about what was said, because you may have just been, it may have caught you off guard initially, but if you read it aloud, you can kind of gather that tone, that text, what type of voice they were using when they wrote that communication, and it may help you feel better about it. Now, if you do receive some trouble in communication, some very unpersonalized or some communication that does upset you, It's always okay to write a response, but then I say leave it and then come back later. So I take a break. You can write your initial feelings out, and then I say walk away, cool down, come back and reread it, and then that'll give you a better way to really look at how you want to communicate your feelings back. Because sometimes you can get a message and you can feel very upset, very heated so quickly that you want to just respond right away because you're so emotionally charged. And one of the best suggestions I have is write that response, but don't send it. Come back, reread it, read it aloud to really hear how it sounds, and then maybe you can send it if that's what you want to send, or maybe you'll make some edits. I would say also when you do receive some communication that really does upset you, is please feel free to express how the communication made you feel. It's important because sometimes people can write something, they don't take these first steps where they're reading it aloud, really thinking about how they're what they're writing, how it sounds, and how it may be conveyed, so that it may be completely unintentional. So if you communicate with the person how it made you feel with your instructor, when you left me this feedback, how you said it, how you wrote it, it really made me feel discouraged because of X, Y, and Z, because that's something that is okay to bring up. Your instructor, for the most part, will probably work with you to craft how they write their feedback to you differently so that they understand where you're coming from. It's not necessarily always an intentional put down. And when you are communicating how the communication made you feel, it's always important to use I statements. It's always, when you wrote, when you can say, when I read this statement, I felt this way. It's always a key to de-escalation or resolution when you can convey to the person about how something made you feel, because it's not taking away, it takes away from this conversation of a you did this and you did this to me. It doesn't put this on the other person. It's allowing you to convey to the other person how you're feeling, and really get into a constructive conversation of how you two can work to make this better. It's not like, this is all your fault and you need to stop it. But you do have to understand when you do something, when you write my feedback this way, when you communicate to me in the discussion boards and you said this, it made me feel like this. I felt discouraged. I felt disrespected. It's important to feel empowered to communicate that to your instructors, because again, they need feedback just like you need feedback in your courses. If they don't understand, they may not, or if they don't know that how they're writing feedback or how they're communicating with you is upsetting you, they may not ever know unless you make them aware, because they may be doing it unintentionally. And unless you bring it to their attention, they may not know that they're upsetting you. And for the most part, they're going to want to work with you, be apologetic, and they'll craft how they communicate with you differently. And it's the same thing if a peer comes up to you and lets you know that how you were discussing a discussion board, you can always ask them how it had them feel. And that's a good way to put it back on someone who may be upset with something you wrote, because it really takes them into a retrospective sense of how they're feeling, not just angry, but really what was it that made them upset, or what was it about what you wrote that bothered them. And it can kind of get you in a constructive mind space. And I would say the last thing is refrain from assumptions and accusations. So don't always assume that because something was written this way that's really the meaning. It's hard. It's probably the hardest thing to do, to really not jump to conclusions and assumptions and make accusations, because it's a lot more work to work through it and to be to take the high road and to communicate your feelings. But if you can do that, 10 to 1, you're going to have a positive outcome on the other end. You're going to be able to work through with the person, be it a peer in a course or with your instructor, and it's always if you kind of try to navigate this miscommunication, if you try to navigate communication that upsets you, and you do it in a polite and coming from a sense of, really how you feel, and how you can, you're trying to work with this person better. Nobody's going to turn that down. You'll be pleasantly surprised with how many instructors will want to work with you, and really take the feedback you give them about how they communicate, to how many take it to heart. So I do want to leave some time for questions, so I'm moving to my recap. Sorry if it's been a lot of information in a short time, but just remember that online communication, essentially, I know it's the easiest thing to remember, is so different than in-person communication, and that online communication in a classroom is different than online communication with a friend, or with a family member. That email communication to an instructor is going to be inherently different than an email communication even with a coworker or with a friend. Again, my best thing is always read aloud any communication you're sending or you receive. It allows you to really hear the tone. It allows you to kind of get the how things will come off to other people, or how things are supposed to come off. One of my biggest points is all caps isn't always a bad thing. It's not always yelling. It could be excitement, and that could be yelling, but it could be excitement, it could be emphasis, it could be a ton of different stylistic choices instead of angry yelling. Ask clarifying questions. I really highly recommend standing up and asking clarifying questions, and letting others know how communication that you received made you feel, because that's only a positive communication. You're only going to come out of it with your instructor or with your peer in a positive place and being able to communicate better. However, if all this doesn't work, and you've tried to resolve or de-escalate, or you've made how you felt known, don't hesitate to reach out and let someone know that you're having an issue, because there are lots of resources, especially at this university, but any online distance learning program, any in-class or online classroom, you have resources in which you can let someone know when you're having an issue that you aren't able to reconcile, or if the other person's actually not going to work with you. So make sure that you can ask what those resources are, and make sure you're, after you've attempted to resolve, de-escalate, or reconcile, and you still feel like you're being communicated to poorly, that you make it known to somewhere else, because it may be a conversation ultimately that it can't come from you, or that needs to come from someone else to improve how someone is communicating in the online forum. So, do we have any questions? I see that the chat has been very busy. I want to thank everybody for participating. But if you have any questions, I feel like the line is kind of open, or you can type them in the chat. I will say, yeah, Zachary, taking a break, logging off, coming back to it, that's always a great strategy. Yeah, Kayla, that's definitely true. Asking further questions if you don't feel like you fully understand their message is important. Again, no one's ever going to turn you away for asking questions. It's always one of the most important strategies. And sorry if I'm looking away, but I've got like 3 monitors in front of me, and I'm trying to monitor the chat on this screen. Zachary, I would say, using all caps when expressing excitement, it's okay. But there's other things you can do to kind of convey the excitement. So when I talked about punctuation, you know, sometimes even using like a smiley face in communication, even though it may not be the most academically sourced use of punctuation, but in a discussion board, that is something that conveys not yelling, but excitement. A few exclamation points, the how you're addressing the tone, if you're being polite on the other end, so if you're using caps, but you're also being polite, thanking them for their post or their discussion or their response, those other factors in that communication, they won't necessarily assume that the all caps is yelling, because the rest of your communication, the punctuation, and the other parts where you're expressing tone are positive.
Looks like we got about 4 minutes left in our room. Anyone has any questions, this is our time to ask our expert.
Yeah, expert. Dan, do you use the Ashford Cafe? I do sometimes use the Ashford Cafe. Oh, Yancey, what about an instructor that does not respond to your post? So on that, I would recommend shooting them a personal email. If you need feedback or if you need response and you haven't had a response to your discussion board post, I would always say be proactive, reach out to your instructor, and send them a personal email asking them for feedback or asking them if they had thoughts on your last discussion board. And then if you don't get a response to that, that's something that you would want to loop in your advisor on. Kayla, so sometimes when asking for clarification from another person may get irritated. How would you suggest preventing this? The first thing is to make sure that when you're asking clarifying questions, is to just be as polite as possible. So you want to thank them for their time initially, for reading your message. You want to explain where you're coming from. Again, why you have these questions. So could it be that you didn't understand something, that if it's something that upset you, or if it's something you need more information about, or you have this goal and so you need this information that they have, then I would ask the questions, and then I would kind of end it again with thanking them, appreciating and being respectful of their time, and making yourself available. So if you address it very politely, and you acknowledge the fact that they're going to take time out of their future to get back to you, usually you're going to get a positive response. Lucinda, yeah. Sometimes after using the all caps, blatantly saying this is a good thing, that works too, because you're getting straight to the point. That's nice direct communication to make sure that people are understanding your tone correctly. Zachary, so that's tough. The question is, what should I do when I post a response to a classmate but do not receive a response back? Sometimes you will get unresponsiveness, but you can only do so much. So if you have put that in the other person, if you put that ball in the other person's court, you can only be patient. And peers aren't necessarily required to respond to you. So sometimes you really have to look at the value of what you were asking or what that post was, and determine if it's something that you want to keep pursuing, or if it's something that after you've given your patient, you've given enough time to, that you just have to unfortunately move on. Well, thank you everyone Thank you for joining me today. I hope that the presentation was useful, and I appreciate the conversation in the chat. You're all lively, and I always appreciate participation. Thank you so much for joining the student track, the second year only that the TLC's had a student track. So it's been my pleasure to give this presentation today. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.